Let's paint a miniature. The first step is to prime the figure black. We prime black because the layers I apply later will use the black primer to create color modulation. Black primer also makes it easier to hide imperfections in my work, which I like very much. All we need to do is make sure every nook and cranny of the model is covered with primer, and then we move on to the next step. Base coating. This step is focused on covering 80 to 90% of the model with our base color. In this case, I'm going with Vallejo Model Color Emerald, as it's pretty close to the blue-green color that the Turkina Keshik unit uses in Battletech canon. So as I apply these colors, you'll see that I'm not just hosing the entire model down, I'm specifically targeting various zones, we'll call it. These zones are going to be where the majority of my color is laid down. This way I get some of the black primer showing through around the edges of each zone, which gives you natural light and dark spots on the model. The zones I want to focus on are going to be areas that would generally make the most sense to be brighter, but will add a little artistic liberty to make it look nice, regardless of realism. So when applying this layer, I'm going to focus my attention to the upper parts of the mech, the tops of the missile racks, the tops of the head and torso, the upper portions of the arms, the upper parts of the back, the upper legs and lower legs, the tops of the feet as well. Basically try to think of any part that would most likely be hit by the sun if the mech was standing around at noon. After this, we move on to our base highlights. Now our goal is to strengthen the variation between the light and dark areas that we created in the previous step. To do this, I'm simply going to use a lighter blue-green, in this case Vallejo Model Color Blue-Green, but I'm also going to add an even lighter color to that, Vallejo Model Color Ivory. This will increase the brightness or value of our color even further and help us accomplish our goal of pushing the contrast of the base coat. As I apply this next color, I'm going to pay much more attention to where it's applied. I want to only brighten the previous base coat in the same zones we spoke about earlier, but we'll cover much less of the surface with this layer. Try to be careful and build up the highlight in each zone, and don't go overboard, as we don't want to wash out the base coat, only enhance it. At this point, I'm finished with the base coating. Now I'm going to move on to brush painting. With a brush, I'm going to go ahead and base coat all the details that we can't do as easily with an airbrush, such as the weapons, the lime green highlights of the Turkina Keshik unit, and any small stuff like that. Personally, I like to paint the gun barrels as well as leg and arm joints in a bluish or purplish gray color. This is sort of like a simplified non-metallic metal technique, but it's very straightforward. You can use metallic paints like a silver or iron color if you prefer. I just like using grays as I think it makes the whole model look much more cohesive. Once we finish this step, it's on to the shading. Now this is where things get interesting. For shading my models, I like to use enamels exclusively. In this case, I use Tamiya Black Panel Liner because it's a high quality product that comes in a sealable jar that includes a small brush to apply the enamel. What is enamel and why use it over normal acrylic washes? Well, enamel paints are a type of oil-based paint. Because they're oil-based, they're thinned out with a type of mineral spirits, and this gives us two advantages. One being that enamel washes like this flow better than water-based acrylic washes because mineral spirits do not have surface tension like water does. As a result, when we apply it, it will flow much nicer than acrylics. But the more important advantage to me is that it can be cleaned up with clean mineral spirits after the enamel wash is dried. Quick note though, please use enamels in a ventilated area. Open a window, turn on a fan, or even buy a respirator with organic vapor filters to be safe. Enamel fumes are harmful and unpleasant, so be safe. If you're worried about this, you can do the same thing with oil paints and odorless mineral spirits. Just know that it takes longer to dry than proper enamel paints. So as you'll see in the footage here, I'm applying the enamel wash over the entire surface area of the model. I do this because when we paint using matte paints, the enamel can sometimes stain the surface, which I use to my advantage to slightly darken the base color, so that our following highlight steps stand out even more, but also to avoid any visible staining or tide marks on the model. Once I've applied the enamel, I then let it dry or even speed it up with a hair dryer, and then it's time to clean it up, and this is where the magic of enamels comes into play. Using a cheap makeup sponge that you can get in bulk on Amazon or eBay, as well as low odor mineral spirits that I can purchase at a local hardware store, I will then begin to wipe the enamel paint off of the raised surfaces of the model, leaving the black enamel wash in the cracks and recesses. This gives us a very strong black lining and additional subtle shading across the entire model, helping further the contrast of our Mini. The next step is one of the most important steps of all. We're now going to begin applying highlights to the model, first with some light sponge chipping. To start, I need a piece of sponge or foam. In this case, I will use a piece of pluck foam, which I then tear the end off to form a nice rough textured end. After this, I go ahead and mix a highlight color for this step. Using the emerald color we started with, I'm going to add some light yellow to my palette to brighten the emerald. I'm also adding a little bit of retarder to each pool of paint that I mix. This isn't required, but it can help extend the drying time of your paint and makes it much easier to use smaller brushes like you'll see me use here soon. For sponge chipping, we just want to tap the end of the sponge on our paint and then wipe some of this paint off onto a paper towel or similar, sort of like dry brushing. Then it's as simple as poking at the model. I'm going to focus this around the edges and upper surfaces of the model. You can go as heavy or as light as you want with this, or you can skip it entirely if you want. I like it because it adds more interesting texture to the model. Now we're really going to make this model shine by picking out edges with some nice bright highlights. I'm going to mix more light yellow into my base color, and then with a nice sharp brush, in this case a 2-0, I will begin edge highlighting. With edge highlighting, I like to pick out only edges that would likely catch light. Sort of like in the airbrushing stage, I want to pick out edges that are higher up towards the sun. So I'll focus these highlights on any edges on the upper surfaces of the model, or the upper edges of panels on the sides of legs, arms, etc. You don't have to edge highlight every single edge. In fact, doing so may make your model look strange to some people, so I prefer to stick to what makes the most sense realistically. On particularly sharp edges of the model, you should be able to use the side of the brush to apply your edge highlight. For all other edges, we simply make small strokes along the edge using the sharp tip of our brush. Once I've highlighted all of the edges that need it, it's time to do one final pass to strengthen these highlights. For this, I'll be adding Vallejo Model Color Ivory to my palette, and I mix this with my previous highlight to brighten it even further. Then, like before, we apply this highlight color to the upper edges of the model, but in this case we will be very sparing with the application, only applying them here and there, in very small and select areas. This is just to brighten up certain spots and, again, add more interest and variation to the model. But we also need to highlight the gray parts as well as the lime green. For that, we will follow similar logic. I'm going to mix ivory into lime green and ivory into my gray base coat used on the gun barrels and such. Then I will highlight these parts in a similar manner. However, for the gun barrels specifically, rather than simply doing edge highlights, I'm going to do some very simplified layering. So I will first apply a broad highlight along the top of each gun barrel using horizontal strokes down the length of each barrel. After that, I will add more white and do much smaller strokes down the center of the previous highlight. And just like that, we have a very basic, simplified non-metallic metal gun barrel. We can apply the same idea on the backs of the leg joints as well, but making vertical strokes instead of horizontal. The lime green is as simple as throwing a few light brush strokes along the edges of the parts. And with that step finished, our model is nearly complete. The only thing left to do is to add some details and paint the cockpit. For the cockpit, I'm going to use layering. First, I start by mixing black with red to create a nice dark red. I base coat the cockpit panels of the Turkina with this color first. Then we'll go up to pure red, which I apply to 85% of the cockpit glass. I will then apply a thin layer of orange, covering a smaller portion of the glass. Then mix 50-50 yellow and orange, covering again less of the glass. Then pure yellow, covering very little of the glass. And finally a mix of ivory and yellow for a tiny little highlight along the cusp of the brightest point of the cockpit. Details, I like to add hazard stripes and little marks and arrows. Things like this really help sell the scale of these giant tiny robots. Hazard stripes are as simple as throwing down a base coat of yellow and then applying fine black lines equal distance apart going diagonally across the yellow stripe. For marks and such, I like to do little circles, triangles, and lines. These help imply that maybe there are warning symbols, squad identification marks, things like this on the model. Just apply them in various areas where it makes sense to you, and with that, we're done. I slap the model on a base, give it a good layer of matte varnish, and we're finished. I hope that you enjoyed this video and found it helpful. I know not everybody has an airbrush, so I will be filming other videos to show how to apply the same approach to painting miniatures, but without the airbrush step in the future. I'll also be making videos on making custom hard surface bases like the one you see on the Turkina here, and much more. Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you've enjoyed it, subscribe to see more in the future. If you want to hang out with other like-minded miniature painters, I run the Mini Painting Discord server, and there's a link to join in the description below. I hope you have a good day, and thank you for watching.